The Yanthus Prime Job, a Pepper Melange adventure. Written by Robert Kroese. Narrated by J.D. Ledford. Chapter 1. Pepper Melange knew the man was trouble as soon as he walked in the bar. His face was unshaven and his clothes were stained and threadbare. He glanced nervously about the room and then made his way toward her. It was in the middle of the afternoon, so the place was nearly deserted. Only a few degenerate stragglers hung out in dark corners, awaiting the next off-planet shuttle. The man's hair was greasy and his eyes were bloodshot. Several small insects buzzed around his head. Definitely a cop. He leaned over the bar toward her.
"You got any pea drop?"
he asked in a hushed tone. "I don't know what that is," replied Pepper flatly, rubbing a towel around the inside of a glass.
"Oh, you know,"
said the man, glancing around.
The good stuff. Fee-fi."
"Are you talking about drugs?" asked Pepper loudly. Nobody in the place took any notice.
"Shh,"
the man hissed.
"Filsifine. I'm jacking. Bad. You got any?"
Pepper rolled her eyes. Why did the new recruits always pick her bar? At least once a month, without fail, one of these greenhorns would come in trying to score Filsifine, Serini Java powder, or one of the hundreds of other narcotics officially forbidden by the neo-puritanical laws of Yanthus Prime. The first few times she got mad and kicked them out. Then she started amusing herself at their expense, but that got old pretty fast too. These days, she had a different way of handling them. "First of all," she began, "you're jonesing, not jacking. Second, no, you're not."
"I am,"
he insisted.
I'm jonesing. I'm jonesing like super bad."
"No," she said. "You're not. If you were jonesing for Filsifine, you'd have the shakes."
"I do,"
he replied, holding out his hand. It shook uncontrollably. "No, not just your hand. Your whole body." His whole body began to shake.
"Look at me,"
he said.
"I'm a desperate man."
"And your eyes would be crossed."
"Oh, geez,"
he said, his eyes crossing.
"They're doing it again. They've been doing that all day."
"And you'd wet yourself." His eyes uncrossed, and he stopped shaking.
"Okay, fine. I'm not a Filsifine addict. How'd you know?"
Pepper sighed. "You've got the standard 2-day beard, and your clothes look like they came from Addicts R Us. You're straight out of Central Casting, buddy. Do they have some kind of checklist for the new narc officers with my bar on it?" One of the insects the cop had brought in had taken an interest in her, and she swatted futilely at it.
"The training manual says the spaceport bars are rife with illicit activity."
"There are 16 other bars near the spaceport. Why do you guys always come in here?" He shrugged.
"Your place looks the rifest. Can I have a drink?"
"Sure. What do you want?"
"Add a Varian whiskey."
She poured the drink and handed it to him. He slid a 5-credit coin across the bar to her and took a gulp of the whiskey.
"I hope you don't mind me saying so,"
he said.
But you don't look much like a spaceport bartender.
Yeah, said Pepper. And what's a spaceport bartender supposed to look like? The man gulped.
Well, most of them are...
Male.
Yeah, and...
Old.
Right, and...
Fat.
Yeah, and...
Ugly.
I think that pretty much sums it up,
said the cop. Are you hitting on me, officer?
What?
Asked the man.
No, ma'am, I'm working.
Pepper nodded. The guy was cute in a dim-witted sort of way, and he didn't seem put off by Pepper's aggressive demeanor. With her long, jet-black hair, svelte figure, and piercing blue-green eyes, Pepper was used to getting a lot of attention from men. Most of them turned tail and ran as soon as she opened her mouth, though. This guy was either braver or dumber than most. She thought for a moment about taking him upstairs, but she decided against it. He seemed like the sort to fall in love easily, and that was one thing Pepper didn't need.
So,
the cop said,
do you know where a guy would go to find some black market narcotics?
Red market, Pepper corrected.
Huh?
What you're looking for is red market drugs, not black market.
In training, they said black market. What's the red market?
She sighed again. How can they not teach you guys this stuff? Red market drugs are covered by the Yanthus Prime Controlled Substance Act, but not distributed by the Ursa Minor Mafia. So you can arrest red market drug dealers without running afoul of the mob.
I thought the mob were the bad guys.
Are you kidding? Pepper asked. The mob is the only thing that keeps Heinous Vlack and his Malarkian Marines from crushing the life out of Yanthus Prime. As long as the Ursa Minor Mafia has a significant presence in the Yanthus system, the Malarkey doesn't dare to send in Marines to quell dissent.
But if the police and the Malarkey teamed up, they could easily chase out the mob.
Why would the police do that? So that they can become a puppet of the Malarkey? Use your head, man. If you're going to try to make a dent in the burgeoning illegal narcotics trade on Yanthus Prime, you need to be aware of the delicate balance of power. The man took another swallow of his drink and then stared at it intently for several seconds, his brow furrowed. Pepper had seen this look before. He was reassessing what he had learned in police training with the complex realities of Yanthus Prime.
So,
he said at last,
what drugs are considered red market?
Pepper thought for a moment. Well, definitely not falsifying. The whole supply chain is controlled by the mob. And not Serini Java powder either. Euphorium is still technically red market, but I hear the mob's looking into taking it over, so I'd stay away from Euphorium dealers too. Same for Chicolini and Starweed. You could try to score some of the new synthetics, like Transin or Solipsen, but the problem there is you risk pissing off the pharmaceutical cartels. You're better off crossing the mob. The man threw up his hands.
What does that leave? Fizz dust?
Pepper shook her head. No, fizz dust. Fizz dust is green market.
Green market? What the hell is that?
Use or sale is prohibited by the laws of Yanthus Prime, and distribution isn't handled by the mob. It's also on the Malarkey's list of prohibited substances.
Perfect,
cried the cop.
I'll arrest every fizz dust dealer within 20 clicks of the spaceport."
"No, you won't," replied Pepper.
"I won't?"
"No. Although the Malarkey officially frowns on fizz dust, they unofficially encourage its use by citizens of subjugated planets. Keeps them docile. If you start arresting fizz dust dealers, you risk getting accidentally shot by a Malarkeyan peacekeeper." The cop finished his drink and stared dejectedly at the empty glass.
"Well, that's it then. There aren't any illegal drugs left for me to crack down on."
"Sure there are," said Pepper. "Sam Suharu's hair regrowth tonic, for one."
"Who the hell is Sam Suharu?"
"Oh, local businessman. Nice guy. Developed this stuff in his basement. Overnight cure for baldness."
"So he's some kind of quack. Snake oil salesman."
"Oh, no. Probably the most honest guy you'll ever meet, and the stuff really works. I know a guy who used it. Grew 6 inches of hair in one night."
"There must be side effects then."
Pepper nodded. "Yeah, cleared his acne right up."
"If this stuff is so great, why is it illegal?"
"Well, he sells it for half the price of the leading baldness remedy sold by Orion Pharmaceuticals. He refuses to cut a deal with the mob. And because he manufactures the stuff locally, the Malarkey doesn't get a cut."
"What about the police? What do they have against him?"
"Nothing. But they've got to arrest somebody, or it looks like they aren't doing their jobs. And as you've noted, they don't have a lot of other options." The cop frowned.
"Well, I guess I have to start somewhere,"
he said.
"Do you know where the dealers of this hair tonic hang out?"
"Dealers," said Pepper. "There are no dealers. It's just Sam. He comes in for a drink most afternoons if you want to wait for him. He likes to sit right over there and read his newspaper."
"What does he look like?"
"You can't miss him. He's a little guy, about 60 years old, and he has a bad knee, so he uses a cane."
"Does he have bodyguards or anything?"
Pepper laughed. "Sam? No, I don't think anybody's ever tried to hurt him. Why would they? He's the nicest guy you'll ever meet. Reminds me of my grandpa." The cop nodded dumbly. Pepper saw the conflict in his eyes. "You want another drink?" she asked. He nodded, and she poured him another. As he raised it to his lips, the door to the bar opened. A small, slightly slumped figure was silhouetted against the sunlight. "Sam!" yelled Pepper cheerily. "Speak of the devil. You want the usual?" Sam entered the bar, slowly moving his cane forward with his left hand, his feet shuffling after. He raised his hand toward Pepper in a perfunctory greeting, mumbled something, and gradually made his way to the table Pepper had indicated earlier. The cop watched him coldly, his right hand patting something under his jacket. Sam lowered himself into a chair, pulled a newspaper from under his arm, and began to read. "Here, I'll introduce you," said Pepper. She had poured a drink and began walking toward Sam. The cop downed his drink, took a deep breath, and stood up. He followed Pepper toward the old man. "Here you go, Sam," said Pepper, setting the drink on the table. Sam looked up at the man next to her. "Sam, this is—" Pepper began. "Actually, I don't know your name."
"Blaine,"
said the cop, whose nervousness had returned, but it no longer seemed to be an act.
"Blaine Caswell."
"New bartender?"
asked Sam, looking over Blaine skeptically. "Blaine's a customer," said Pepper. "He wants to buy some of your hair tonic." Sam grunted, gave a small nod, and reached into his jacket. Blaine's hand shot inside his jacket. A split second later, he had a laser gun trained on Sam. His hand shook, and he was blinking away the sweat pouring down his brow.
"Relax, Sonny,"
said Sam irritably, pulling a small rectangular box from inside his jacket.
"It's just a sample case."
He set the box down on the table in front of him. Blaine sighed in relief and slid his gun back in its holster. Sam opened the case and pulled out a snub-nosed stun gun.
"Here's your free sample,"
he said, and shot Blaine in the chest. The cop gave a startled squeak and slumped to the ground, unconscious. None of the other patrons looked up. Sam put the gun back in its case and slipped it inside his jacket.
"Hair tonic?"
he asked Pepper. She shrugged. "I had to get your attention somehow. How much can I get for him?" He regarded the unconscious cop dubiously.
"He's barely out of the academy. Not much good to us."
"Never hurts to have another cop on the payroll. Do your standard number on him. Strip him to his skivvies and take a few photos of him surrounded by hookers snorting fizz dust." Sam chuckled.
"My hookers have better things to do with their time than entertain greenhorn cops. And I did most of the work. I'll give you 20 credits for him."
20 credits? Cried Pepper in disbelief. "Come on, Sam. Work with me here. The way you guys are squeezing me, you could at least compensate me fairly when I hand a narco to you. By the way, you should have heard all the nice things I said about you. I said you reminded me of my grandpa." Sam smiled and shook his head.
"You're charming, Pepper, but flattery will only get you so far. I'll give you 40 credits for the rookie, if you help me carry him to my car, but you're still 400 credits short this month."
Blaine Caswell groaned, and his head lolled from left to right.
"Better hurry."
Pepper nodded and removed the rookie's laser gun, setting it down on the table in front of Sam, and then grabbed the young man under his arms. Sam took to his feet, and together they carried him to Sam's vehicle, a shiny red Scaramouche 8000 hover car. Sam popped the trunk, and they dumped the limp rookie inside. Sam slammed the trunk shut and wiped his damp brow with a handkerchief.
"I should be charging you for making me work so hard,"
Sam muttered. "You are charging me, Sam. 1,000 credits a month, in case it slipped your mind. And while I appreciate the protection your organization provides, I have to wonder." A dull thumping sounded from inside the trunk.
"Shut up!"
Sam yelled, pounding the hover car with his fist.
"Don't make me stun you again."
The thumping stopped. Sam put the handkerchief in his pocket and went back inside the bar. Pepper followed, taking a moment to regard the neon sign above the entry that marked the establishment's name. The sign read, "The Wobbly Monolith," and next to the letters was an ominous black slab outlined in red. The red rectangle flickered between nearly vertical and a 20-degree slant in a way that suggested, at least to the very imaginative and very drunk, a slab of stone that was about to fall over. Pepper noted that 2 of the letters on the sign had now gone dark, so that the establishment's name appeared to be the Wobbly Monolith. Pepper sighed, making a mental note to call the sign repairman as soon as she had paid the rent and her monthly dues to Sam. She followed Sam back into the bar. Sam had returned to his seat and picked up the newspaper. Pepper walked to the table, trying to get up the courage to broach the subject of the monthly dues with Sam again, as she stood there, considering the best approach to take. She noticed a headline on the back page of the newspaper that read, "Emerald of Sobalt Prime to be displayed at City Museum." Pepper let out an involuntary whistle. The Emerald of Sobalt Prime was the most famous gem in the galaxy. It was officially considered priceless, but Pepper figured the black market value was somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million credits. She found herself wondering why the owners, an interstellar jewelry consortium, risked putting it on display in a shady place like Yanthus Prime City. She shook her head and forced her thoughts back to present circumstances. "As I was saying, Sam," Pepper said, "while I appreciate the services the Ursa Minor Mafia provides—"
"Good,"
snapped Sam.
"You appreciate it, you pay for it. Glad we understand each other, Pepper."
"Come on, Sam. Help me out here."
"I've suggested ways to supplement your income in the past, Pepper. You always turn up your nose."
His eyes scanned Pepper's figure. Pepper glared at Sam. "You're not seriously suggesting I go to work at one of your cat houses?"
"Space, no,"
said Sam.
"You're a smart girl with a lot of talents I could find a legitimate place for in my organization. Although, since you mention it, a pretty girl like you—"
"No, Sam, I am not a hooker. And I'm a lousy employee. I like being in charge of my own life." Sam shrugged and went back to his newspaper.
"In that case, get me a drink."
Pepper gritted her teeth and walked back to the bar. She swatted at another of the buzzing insects. The whole spaceport area was plagued by these damn bugs. No matter what Pepper did, they managed to get inside. They annoyed the customers and hurt business. Lately, she'd been spending nearly as much on exterminators as she'd been paying to Sam, to similar effect. She fixed Sam his usual, a scotch and soda, and returned to his table. Setting the glass down without a word, she began to walk away.
"Oh, come now, Pepper,"
said Sam.
"Don't be that way. You know it's just business. I thought we were friends. Didn't you just say I reminded you of your grandfather?"
Pepper sighed, staring out the bar's window at the people on the streets of Yanthus Prime City rushing past. "I tried," she thought. "I really tried." But it was starting to seem like going straight on a planet like Yanthus Prime was a fool's gambit. There were no legitimate business people on Yanthus Prime. There were, in fact, only two types of people: criminals and suckers. Pepper was getting very tired of being among the latter. Sam Suharu wasn't a bad guy. He was just a businessman who had adapted to the legally and ethically ambiguous culture of Yanthus Prime. Sam's employer, the Ursa Minor Mafia, was no more or less corrupt than any other major player on this planet. Every bar in the city had to pay protection money. It was just business.
"Hey, Pepper,"
said Sam quietly, putting down his paper.
"You're a million miles away. What are you thinking about?"
Said Pepper, her ruminations cut short. She turned to face Sam. "I was just thinking about what a Glark turd my grandfather was." Chapter 2. After she locked the doors of the bar, Pepper spent a few hours going over her finances. No matter how she massaged the numbers, there was no escaping the bottom line. She wasn't going to be able to pay her suppliers, her landlord, and the Ursa Minor Mafia this month. And that meant closing the Wobbly Monolith. But shutting down the bar would cut off her only income stream, eliminating the possibility of ever paying off her creditors. She could dodge the suppliers and the collection agencies, but the Ursa Minor Mafia would find her. Going bankrupt was no excuse for missing a payment, and not all the Mafia's agents were as easygoing as Sam Suharu. Pepper grimly assessed her options. If she could scrape together the fare, she could flee off-world, but the Mafia's reach extended across the galaxy. She could go to Sam and explain the situation, but she knew where that would lead. The Ursa Minor Mafia would make her a lowball offer for the Wobbly Monolith that she wouldn't be able to refuse. She'd be lucky to remain on as an employee of the Mafia, working 16 hours a day at a mob bar for the rest of her life. No, there had to be another way. As she wiped down the bar, her eyes fell to the newspaper Sam Suharu had left behind. She grabbed a pen, walked to the table, and sat down, hoping that Sam hadn't done the crossword puzzle. After struggling absent-mindedly with the puzzle for a few minutes, she folded up the paper to swat one of the ubiquitous insects which had landed on the table in front of her. The damn thing was too quick for her, though, and it buzzed away to some dark corner of the bar. It was only in the past few months that the insects, little green things about the size of houseflies, had become a problem. Every business in the area was having trouble with them. The insects didn't bite, but they had an irritating tendency to buzz around customers' ears as if they were being deliberately annoying. Pepper wasn't much for entomology, but the plague of insects had forced her to take an interest, so she had done a little research a few weeks back. The formal name for the insects was Yanthusian swampfly. Apparently, they were swamp dwellers who had until recently been confined to a low-lying marsh a couple of kilometers from the spaceport. The original settlers of Yanthus Prime had left the marshes alone, partly because of the intrinsic undesirability of the land, and partly out of a superstitious fear of the insects. Although the flies had been declared non-sentient by the Malarkey's Native Species Identification and Protection Bureau, a belief persisted among a small tribe of human squatters on the swampy land that the insects possessed a basic sort of consciousness at the swarm level. The squatters even claimed to be able to communicate in a rudimentary way with the swarms. Supposedly, the squatters had been granted permission to build houses and farms on the insects' land in exchange for the settlers digging ruts in neighboring tracts to make the land more amenable to the insects. Whatever agreement the squatters may have had with the insects went out the window when the developers bulldozed the houses and filled in the marshes to build the spaceport. The remaining marshes around the spaceport were gradually filled in over the course of the next several years as demand for real estate in the area grew. The last few acres had been filled in last year, and the surviving insects fled to nearby neighborhoods. The developers had expected the swamp flies to die off after a few weeks, but the insects' stubborn refusal to fully relinquish their former territory gave credence to the hypothesis, posited by a local scientist a few months earlier, that they were acting out of spite. Having failed to kill the insect, Pepper set down the paper. Her eyes alighted on the article about the Emerald of Sobalt Prime, and she gave in to the temptation to read it. Apparently, the jewelry consortium that owned the emerald had put it on a 27-planet promotional tour. Yanthus Prime seemed like an odd choice for a tour stop, as it was known as a hotbed of crime and corruption. Pepper found herself daydreaming, and when she snapped out of it, she realized she'd drawn a map of the featured exhibit wing of the City Museum on the newspaper from memory. She sighed and shook her head. I swore I was never going back to that life. but it didn't seem she had much choice. It was either go back to thieving or spend the rest of her life as an indentured servant to the mob. As it was, her efforts to go straight had hardly been a rousing success on the legal front, having resulted in her becoming an accomplice to the kidnappings of several police officers in the service of the Ursa Minor mob. Sam always released the cops after thoroughly humiliating and incriminating them, but kidnapping was kidnapping. It was hard to feel bad for the wide-eyed rookies who came into her bar looking to bust a helpless old man to jumpstart their own careers in law enforcement, but the fact was that she'd fallen back into a life of crime without meaning to, and the worst sort of crime at that, the low-paying kind. If she allowed the Ursa Minor Mafia to take over the wobbly monolith, there was no telling what sorts of shenanigans they'd expect her to take part in. The options, then, were to schlep along in some way or other as a bottom-rung mob lackey, or to make a conscious choice to dive back into a life of crime. Pepper was never one for schlepping. Stealing the Emerald of Sobalt Prime would be a challenge, but Pepper was no stranger to museum heists. She had, in fact, stolen an original work by the famous Barishavian sculptor Shashavaslapt from the very same museum where the emerald was going to be showcased, which was why she had the museum's layout committed to memory. The Shashavaslapt theft had been a challenge because the sculpture, a bronze likeness of the Melarkian primate himself, weighed nearly 400 kilos and was the size of a small hover car. She'd had to hire an anti-grav crane to remove the statue from the museum and locate a safe place to stash the statue until she could unload it. Pepper had counted on a big payday to compensate her for these expenses. The statue of the primate was supposedly worth nearly 10 million credits because it was the last work Shashavaslapt ever produced. Pepper found out the reason for this only after completing the heist. Shashavaslapt had been executed for the crime of creating an unflattering likeness of the Melarkian primate. Apparently, Shashavaslapt had made the mistake of rendering the primate's proportions with scrupulous exactitude, and word had reached the primate's office on Sardonic 5. The statue itself was ordered destroyed. The primate sent his chief enforcer, Hanus Vlak, to Yanthus Prime to oversee its destruction. For weeks, Yanthus Prime City was overrun with Melarkian Marines looking for the statue. Melarkian Marines weren't known for being particularly clever, but they were persistent, and their sheer numbers made it virtually impossible for Pepper to move the statue. It was clear Vlak and his minions weren't going to leave until they'd found it. Finally, Pepper had been forced to call in an anonymous tip, informing the Malarkey where she'd stashed the sculpture. Hanus Vlak's Marines melted the statue with their laser guns and were gone the next day. Pepper lost her life savings on the job, but the Emerald of Sobalt Prime was different. Yes, it would be under tighter security than the Shashavaslapt sculpture, but once she boosted it, it would be easy to hide and move, assuming that she could avoid getting her legs broken by Sam's thugs in the meantime. If she could get even a tenth of the stone's reputed value, she'd be able to pay off the Ursa Minor Mafia and keep the bar open indefinitely. But as she thought this, she realized it was never going to happen. If she managed to steal the Emerald of Sobalt Prime, she could never go back to a normal life. Both because the cops would never leave her alone, and because the taste of a score like that would ruin her for civilian life forever. It was hard enough to get out of the life the first time. No, she wouldn't be sticking around to keep the wobbly monolith running. If she did this job, she'd jump at her first chance to get off planet. The newspaper article said that the emerald would be on display for 3 weeks starting tomorrow. That didn't give her a lot of time. There would be bribes to be paid, equipment to be purchased, and plans to be made, all without raising the suspicion of the local cops. Pepper was fairly certain they'd given up on pinning the Shashavaslopt heist on her by now, but you couldn't be too careful on a job like this. If anybody at YPCPD caught a whiff of her being involved in anything that smelled like a heist, they'd find some pretense to arrest her and hold her until after the emerald had moved on. Being behind on her mob dues, she couldn't count on Sam to help her with the cops. And once the YPCPD realized she was no longer under mob protection, they'd throw the book at her. No way around it. This was a tricky proposition. Chapter 3. The next day, Pepper left the closed sign up on the bar window and took the hover-rail to the Yanthus Prime City Museum. After paying the admission fee in the lobby, Pepper made her way into the museum, meandering from one exhibit to the next, trying to muster what might pass for genuine interest in surgical tools from the Yanthus Prime Civil War and fossils from the Yanthusian interdiluvial period. Eventually, she wandered into the wing that housed the gems on display as part of the Jewelry Consortium tour. The main attraction, the Emerald of Sobalt Prime, was ensconced in a glass cage in the center of an octagonal room in the middle of the wing, with entrances to the north, south, east, and west. Pepper entered from the west and strolled slowly around the display, taking it in from all angles. She smiled at the guard standing at attention in the corner, and he regarded her quizzically. Whoops, thought Pepper. I really need to avoid smiling. She had stuck Plastibone inserts in her cheeks to confuse the facial recognition software used by the museum's security systems, and they had the effect of making her look like a maniacally cheerful squirrel when she smiled. The important thing was that they would prevent the museum's security from flagging her visit, as they undoubtedly had her on a list of theft suspects. Fortunately, there were enough visitors to the exhibit that she didn't draw much attention. She glanced around the room just long enough to get a comprehensive 360-degree view, making a note of the plasteel shutters that would slam down in case of an attempted theft. Then she meandered through the rest of the wing, forcing herself to linger at a few other exhibits before returning the way she had come. The entire visit took less than an hour. Back at the wobbly monolith, she climbed the stairs to her tiny apartment, made herself a sandwich, and popped out her contact lenses. She placed the lenses into the nanoplug interface reader connected to a computer. A light went on, letting her know that dozens of cilia-like tendrils were connecting to microscopic interface points around the edges of the lenses. A paper-thin screen unfurled like a sail from the computer, expanding to its default size of nearly 1 meter in length and 2/3 of that in height. The screen showed a circular progress indicator that was filling up with blue as data was downloaded from the lenses. It stopped a few seconds later at 18.6 terabytes. She had bought these ultra-high-resolution recording lenses nearly 2 years earlier when planning another heist that had fallen through at the last minute. They weren't cutting edge anymore, but they would certainly give her the information she needed. Both lenses had been recording the entire time she'd been in the museum, producing a complete stereoscopic record of the wing that housed the emerald, as well as much of the rest of the museum. The traveling exhibit wing was her main concern. She tapped a few buttons on the image processing interface on the screen, telling the computer to render a three-dimensional model that she could explore in real time. The program would extrapolate from the data it had received, making it possible for her to view the wing from any angle. As it began to render, though, a warning appeared. Audio data missing. Proceed to render without audio? Whoops, Pepper exclaimed. She'd forgotten to remove her earrings, which had recorded stereophonic audio from her trip to the museum. The audio data was of little direct use. Its value lay in what it could tell the software about the interior of the museum. The echoes of the ambient noises, the hum of the ventilation system, museum visitors chatting, the shuffling of feet would be interpreted and added to the visual data to determine the thickness, texture, and composition of the surroundings. Pepper pulled off the earrings and put them in the receptacle along with the contact lenses. The reader connected to them and downloaded the data. When it was finished, she restarted the rendering process. By the time she'd finished her sandwich and a bottle of Peg-Leg Monkey, the best beer on Yanthus Prime, the rendering was complete. She tapped a key to enter the simulation, and the screen showed the foyer of the museum where she had begun recording. Hand motions allowed her to navigate the museum as if she were walking inside it. As she strolled around the simulated museum, she took note of the security features, the guards, the cameras, the heat sensors, the motion detectors, the plasteel shutter doors. Pepper leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The main problem was the cameras, which were mounted in every room in the museum. In fact, most rooms had several visible cameras, and many more microcams were hidden throughout the wing. There were so many cameras, in fact, that it would be virtually impossible for someone to monitor them all. Creating a diversion of some sort to focus attention elsewhere might be helpful, but that was a tricky tactic. Make the diversion too compelling, and it would summon the YPCPD and trigger a complete lockdown. The other problem was that no diversion would draw attention away from the completely automated motion detectors that would trigger an alarm if Pepper entered the exhibit room after hours. Further complicating matters was the fact that the main cameras in the exhibit room were 3D enabled and oscillated at random intervals to get a full view of the room. That meant the infamous Kroese stamp heist trick of unrolling high-res displays of the room in front of the camera wouldn't work. Reproducing an image of the room on a screen would be easy enough. Thanks to the comprehensive recording Pepper had taken, the trick was getting the appropriate image on a screen in front of the camera. With 3D oscillating cameras, even if you could somehow position a large enough screen in front of a camera to cover its full range of view, the camera's 3D calibration algorithm would detect the lack of perspective in the image and trigger an alarm. Fooling these cameras would require more finesse. The obvious solution to the camera problem was to go smaller with the screens rather than larger. She knew the company that manufactured her recording contacts also produced augmented reality lenses that were capable of projecting a high-res image directly into the wearer's eye. If she could have lenses engineered to the specifications of the apertures of the security cameras, there was no reason they couldn't be adapted for this purpose. It would require some programming to match each camera's movements to the image displayed on the lens, but she was fairly certain the rendering software she was using to tour her virtual model of the museum could be adapted for the purpose. She'd essentially be applying custom-designed contact lenses to the cameras. The tough part was going to be getting the lenses over the apertures of the cameras without drawing attention. The guy behind the Kroese stamp heist had used dragonfly-sized bots to move the displays in front of the cameras, But there was a bigger margin of error with screens than with lenses. Lenses would have to be placed accurately to within 1/10 of a millimeter, or the image would be noticeably off. Additionally, the museum had recently installed sensors that would detect bots larger than a gnat. To further complicate matters, every 10 minutes, a weak electromagnetic pulse was sent out from a device below the museum's floor in order to fry the electronics of any bots that were too small to be detected by the sensors. The only reason the electronics in Pepper's lenses had avoided being melted was that their electronics, being a few years old, were just large enough to be immune to the EMP. So, how to place tiny lenses on the apertures of the cameras without anyone noticing and without using bots. Pepper considered the matter for an hour and came up with nothing. Eventually, she fell asleep in her chair, only to be awakened by one of the insects buzzing near her ear. She woke with a start and smacked herself on the side of the head, missing the insect. "Damn you!" she yelled at the little green bug as it buzzed away. "You're not getting your swamp back. Just die already." The insect landed on the wall a few feet away, watching her, as if assessing its options in light of her words. It was hard not to feel a little bad for the thing. Like Pepper, the insect was a victim of forces beyond its understanding or control, and like Pepper, the insect was acting out of desperation, doing the only thing it could think of to do, lashing out at those in power. "If only you knew how little power I have," Pepper mused. "If you want to strike a blow against the establishment, you'd be better off buzzing around the mayor's office or the—" She trailed off as she imagined the little bugs buzzing around the ears of the city's movers and shakers at one of their fancy events at the city museum. She stared at the insect on the wall, and the insect stared back. Was there an intelligence behind those tiny, multifaceted eyes? It seemed doubtful. And yet, the squatters had been convinced that they had been able to communicate with the swarms. Pepper was also struck by the apparent spitefulness of the insect's actions. There was no apparent biological reason for the flies to hang out at her bar. They didn't bite, and they weren't interested in the food or drinks. Their only purpose seemed to be to annoy her and her customers. But why? Were they attempting to exact some small amount of vengeance for the destruction of their habitat? Or were they trying to communicate something? "What do you want?" she asked the insect. The fly took off, buzzed around the room for a moment, and then landed on a napkin on the table in front of Pepper. The same napkin on which Pepper had drawn the interior of the museum. The insect was standing right in the middle of the octagonal exhibit room. "Well, aren't you an ambitious little bug?" Pepper said. "If you want the emerald, you're welcome to it. You have a better chance of getting into that room than I do. If you need somebody to help you unload it, I can hook you up with my fence. Maybe we can come to some kind of arrangement." The insect just stared at her. "Okay, you're starting to creep me out a little," Pepper said. "I don't really buy this claptrap about you being sentient." Still, the insect stared. "Seriously," Pepper said. "Cut it out. Go back to buzzing around the bar, or I'll flatten you." The insect didn't move. "See, that right there is proof that you aren't sentient," Pepper said. If you understood I was threatening you, you'd fly away." Still, the insect didn't move. "Yeah, I get it," said Pepper. "You're calling my bluff. Also, if I didn't harbor some suspicion about you being able to understand me, I wouldn't be talking to you like this. That's one in your column, Bug." Still, the insect didn't move. "Ah!" Pepper cried, unnerved by the insect's indifference. She waved her arms in the air until the insect took off. It made a circuit of the room and then disappeared through the crack under the door. Chapter 4. Pepper moved silently through the museum toward the Emerald of Sobalt Prime. As she neared the gem, she heard a loud buzzing behind her. Just as she was about to reach out her hand to grab the emerald, a swarm of flies flew over her head and descended on it. The flies enveloped the emerald completely and then seemed to take a humanoid form. After a moment, Pepper realized the flies had transformed into the Malarkian enforcer, Yanthus Vlak. Vlak looked just like he did the last time he came to Yanthus Prime. He was an imposing figure, in a tight-fitting crimson leather uniform, his face obscured by a helmet festooned with peacock feathers. A luxurious fur cape billowed from his shoulders. Pepper turned to run, but the plasteel doors slammed shut, trapping her in the room. Vlak drew his laser gun and fired, hitting her squarely in the chest. Pepper woke with a start. "Damn bugs," she muttered, sitting up in bed. She had a vague feeling that the insects had invaded other dreams of hers during the night, too. Was this how the insects communicated? Or was she simply obsessing about them for no good reason? Yanthus Vlak's appearance was strange as well. Vlak hadn't been to Yanthus Prime since he'd overseen the destruction of the Shashavaslapt sculpture. Pepper was fairly certain Vlak didn't even know she existed. And even if he had somehow found out she was behind the theft of the sculpture, she couldn't see how it concerned him. Pepper got up, showered, and made some coffee. Then she sat down with her simulation again. 3 hours later, she was no closer to figuring out how to foil the museum's security. What she needed was something like microbots that could be programmed to apply lenses to the apertures of the security cameras, but they would have to be bots that wouldn't trigger the museum's motion sensors. That meant they would have to be very small and made mostly of organic materials. There was an answer that was as obvious as it was ridiculous. And after another hour of failing to put it out of her mind, Pepper broke down and called the biology department of Yanthus Prime City University. If nothing else, she could at least confirm that the idea was completely impractical, so she could move on to a more realistic solution. Pepper asked the secretary if she could speak to the scientist who had published the paper about intelligent swarms of Yanthusian swamp flies. She was put on hold, and after several minutes the secretary explained to her that the author of that paper, Dr. Sully Harmagen, was no longer at the university. Pepper was unable to get the secretary to explain the reason for Harmagen's departure, and it was only with considerable difficulty that she managed to obtain an address for him. Dr. Harmagen was apparently living off the grid in a mostly unsettled area about 30 clicks south of the city. Her interest piqued. Pepper summoned a robocar and gave it the address she'd been given for Dr. Harmagen. The car dutifully navigated the city roads to the highway that connected Yanthus Prime City to the towns south of it, then veered off onto a poorly maintained dirt road. After several more kilometers, the car stopped in front of a primitive hovel on a small hill overlooking a vast tract of muck. Pepper got out, and the car zipped away. She walked up a narrow sidewalk to the door. Hundreds of the little green flies buzzed around her head. She knocked on the door, and after a minute or so, the door opened. Standing inside was a pear-shaped creature about half Pepper's height. "Dr. Harmingen?" asked Pepper. The pear-shaped creature glared at her with its tiny eyes.
"Not what you were expecting?"
"Well, to be honest," Pepper said, "no." Dr. Harmingen was a member of the Gwildwanki species, with which Pepper was vaguely familiar. The Gwildwanki had originated on a backwater planet in the Perseus arm. They were a largely non-sentient, bipedal ruminant species that was common throughout this part of the galaxy. It had been discovered purely by accident by a very surprised farmer that due to a genetic anomaly, roughly 1 in a million Gwildwanki was not only sentient, but possessed an intelligence that rivaled that of the geniuses of the most advanced races in the galaxy. Far from putting an end to the practice of raising Gwildwanki as livestock, this discovery vastly increased the incentive to raise them. Sentient Gwildwanki could be sold to universities and corporations for a fortune. Many of the best financial analysts in the Crab Nebula were Gwildwanki, who had been rescued from the cattle farms of Volterra 7. Pepper had never actually met a sentient Gwildwanki before. Although she found Gwildwanki steaks to be delicious, she decided to keep this information to herself.
"If you're a journalist,"
Harmingen said, glaring at Pepper,
"I have nothing to say I haven't already said 100 times. You'll have to get your entertainment elsewhere."
I'm not a journalist," Pepper said. "I'm a bartender. My name is Pepper Melange."
"I don't recall requesting a delivery, Pepper Melange,"
Harmingen said dryly.
"Please go away."
He began to close the door. "Wait," Pepper cried. "I'm here about the insects. The little green ones."
"Yanthusian swamp flies,"
Harmingen grunted.
"What about them?"
"I have a proposal for them," Pepper said without thinking. Harmingen stared at her for a moment.
"You have a proposal for the flies?"
There was no point in being coy now, Pepper thought. "You believe they're sentient, don't you? And that you can communicate with them?"
"The media sensationalized my research,"
Harmingen said,
"and cost me my job in the process."
"So the flies weren't telling us to stay off their land?" Pepper asked.
"I think we can assume the flies would prefer that we not destroy their habitat,"
said Harmingen.
"There are those who claim to be able to speak with the swarms, but my research was shut down before I could confirm the swarm's sentience definitively."
"But if you could speak to them now?"
"I can't," said Harmingen. "The university seized my equipment. In any case, the swarm population has been decimated. The potential for intelligence exists only in swarms of 10 million or more. These days there are only a dozen swarms of less than 1 million each. Half of them live on my property. As you can see, I've done what I could to give them a semblance of their former habitat, but it isn't enough. I'm afraid that whatever you wanted to say to the flies, Pepper, it's too late."
Pepper nodded her head. "All right," she said. It was a crazy idea anyway, just something I needed to get out of my system. "Thank you for your time, Doctor." She tapped her comm, intending to call the robocar back.
"Hold on,"
said Dr. Harmingen. Pepper looked at him expectantly.
"Out of curiosity, what was the proposal?"
Pepper regarded Dr. Harmingen. She hadn't decided how much she was willing to tell Dr. Harmingen. Really, she was just hoping to get enough information from him to put the idea of cooperating with the flies out of her mind. But she supposed there was no harm in giving him a rough idea of what she had been considering. "I have, a side business, in addition to tending bar," Pepper said. "I was considering taking on a job, a potentially extremely lucrative job, but I'm not sure I can do it alone."
"And you thought the flies could help?"
"I know, it's crazy," said Pepper, "but for some reason I can't get the idea out of my mind. It's almost like the insects are talking to me." Harmingen studied her dubiously.
"That's highly improbable,"
he said. "Yeah, I realize that," Pepper replied.
"But not impossible,"
Harmingen went on.
"I apologize for my initial rudeness. Very few of my visitors are genuinely interested in my work. Come in, Pepper."
He opened the door to his hovel wider. Pepper hesitated a moment and then followed him inside, ducking to clear the low doorway. She found herself in a very small, very primitive house. To her right was a doorway that led into a tiny office. To her left was a kitchen that was only slightly larger. The room she was in seemed to be a sort of general-purpose entryway and living room. It had one piece of furniture, a small, rudimentary wooden table. In a far corner of the room sat another Gwildwanki, pear-shaped like Dr. Harmingen, but slightly smaller, munching on a small pile of dried grass.
"Don't mind her,"
Harmingen said, indicating the other Gwildwanki.
"She's my wife, Ethel. Non-sentient, of course, but beggars can't be choosers. Sit anywhere you like."
Pepper smiled weakly at Ethel and sat on the stone floor, cross-legged next to the table. Dr. Harmingen sat down across from her. "Are you saying it's possible the insects really are trying to talk to me?" Pepper asked.
"Probably not in the way you are thinking,"
Harmingen said.
"The individual insects are stupid. They merely react to biological stimuli, but each fly communicates in a basic way with all the other flies in its swarm. With a large enough swarm, it's possible for a sort of consciousness to arise."
"Like neurons in a human brain," Pepper said.
"Precisely."
"But you said the swarms are too small for that to happen."
"That's right,"
said Harmingen.
"But the swarms also communicate with each other to some extent. If you could get enough of the smaller swarms together, you could potentially create a metaswarm, a swarm of swarms, if you will."
"But if this metaswarm doesn't already exist," how could it be communicating with me?
I don't necessarily believe it is communicating with you,
Harmingen said.
But understand that consciousness is a continuum. It's possible that the meta-swarm already exists on some level, but it is too weak to communicate overtly. Again, speaking purely hypothetically, it's not impossible that the meta-swarm is imparting ideas to you, perhaps without even intending to.
Like through dreams? Pepper asked. Or individual flies signaling me in some way?
There's no telling how the meta-swarm's attempts at communication might manifest themselves,
Harmingen said.
What exactly do you think they're trying to tell you?
Well, said Pepper, for a while now it seemed like they've been trying to express their anger at the last of their habitat being taken away. It's not just me. All the business owners in my neighborhood have seen it. The flies buzz around aimlessly, apparently just to irritate us. Harmingen nodded.
Like when my wife is mad at me. But she doesn't know how to express it, so she pees behind the dresser.
Pepper nodded uncomfortably, glancing at Harmigen's wife munching away in the corner. Well, anyway, lately the communication has gotten much more specific. I mean, unless I'm imagining it. It started when I happened to see an article in the newspaper. Pepper trailed off, not sure how specific she should be. Also, it occurred to her that she had only noticed the article about the Emerald of Sobalt Prime because she had folded the paper up to swat one of the flies. Was this whole heist the flies' idea? She shuddered as she considered the notion. Had they orchestrated her trip to see Harmingen? Or was she losing her mind?
An article about what?
Harmingen asked. Pepper dodged the question. If this metaswarm existed, would it be able to direct the behavior of individual flies? Like, if there was a specific task the metaswarm wanted completed?
The individual flies act as extensions of the swarm. The flies are the arms and legs of the swarm organism, as well as the eyes, ears, and other senses.
What would you need to confirm the existence of the metaswarm? Pepper asked. Is there a way you could communicate with it directly?
Theoretically possible, but I would need my equipment, which, as I said, is under lock and key at the university.
What if I told you I could help with that? Harmingen studied her for a moment.
This job you're talking about,
he said.
It's not entirely legal, is it?
No, it's not, Pepper replied.
A theft of some sort, I assume,
Harmingen said.
You want to use the flies to get around the security somehow. But why not use bots?
There are sensors that will detect anything with inorganic parts. Even if I could find a bot constructed of entirely organic material, the EMP would short out the picocircuitry.
Sounds like some pretty serious security,
Harmingen observed.
The sort used by museums, particularly museums hosting exhibits of extremely rare and valuable gemstones.
Hypothetically, Pepper agreed.
Yes, hypothetically,
Harmogen said dryly.
I suppose you're aware that the Yanthus Prime City Museum is owned by Yanthus Prime City University, the institution that ruined my life. So you can see how I would, again speaking in purely hypothetical terms, be tempted to cooperate with such an endeavor.
The thought had occurred to me, Pepper said. Why did the university shut you down?
Because they knew I was on to something,
Harmogen said.
If I proved the swarms were sentient, they would get the attention of the Malarkey's Native Species Identification and Protection Bureau. Development of the spaceport and surrounding businesses would have been delayed for years, possibly indefinitely. The university is too dependent on funding from the local real estate developers to let that happen. So they fired me and gave me a severance package contingent on me keeping my mouth shut and withdrawing my paper.
And how are you feeling about that choice? Pepper asked. Harmogen shrugged.
It was the only thing I could do at the time, and it gave me enough money to buy this place. By slowly converting my property to swampland, I've been able to create a refuge for a few million of the flies, but it won't be enough. The flies are part of a very delicate ecosystem. One big drought, like we had 3 years ago, and they'll be wiped out. This is the only region on Yanthus Prime where the flies can thrive. The rest of the planet is too dry.
What if we could buy some more land? Pepper asked. Several square kilometers. Near the city. Convert it to swampland. Could we save them?
Maybe,
said Harmogen.
Is that how you're planning to spend your spoils?
All I need from this job is to pay off a few debts and get off planet. There should be plenty left over to see to the insects' well-being.
I'd have to renege on my confidentiality agreement with the university.
Sure, but you could go public with proof of the metaswarm's sentience. Go directly to the Malarkey's Native Species Identification, whatever it was you mentioned earlier. Have them declare the metaswarm a sentient being. The university will be forced to back down. Pepper didn't like the idea of drawing the attention of the Malarkey, but hopefully she'd be long gone by the time any Malarkeyan bureaucrats showed up.
Said Harmogen. It's an outlandish idea, but I have to admit it would seem the stars have aligned in favor of our cooperation. However, the third of our proposed triumvirate has not yet spoken, at least not in any way I can decipher.
The metaswarm, Pepper said.
Yes,
said Harmogen.
It's possible that you're misinterpreting the metaswarm's motives. Or imagining their attempts at communication. Even with my equipment, I can't guarantee I will be able to summon the Metaswarm. Supposing I can, I'm not sure we'll be able to communicate with it. And even then, it might say no.
Only one way to find out for sure, I guess, Pepper said.
Yes,
Harmogen agreed. You need to understand, Pepper said. There's a chance we could both go to prison for this for a very long time. Harmogen motioned toward the walls of his hovel.
I'm not really seeing the downside.
Pepper nodded. We don't have a lot of time, she said.
Then we'd better get started,
Harmogen said.
How soon can you get me my equipment?
Chapter 5. Stealing Dr. Harmogen's equipment back was surprisingly easy. The security at the university was much laxer than at the museum. All Pepper had to do was rent a van, disable a couple of security cameras, and pick the lock of the biology department. 20 minutes after pulling up in the van, Pepper had all the equipment loaded. She waved to the campus security guard as she drove off. Once she was certain she wasn't being tailed, she made her way back to Dr. Harmogen's hovel. The good doctor was nearly beside himself with excitement at having his equipment back. Even his dim-witted wife seemed to understand something important was happening. She rubbed up against Pepper's legs and made a sort of mooing sound. Pepper scratched Mrs. Harmogen uncertainly behind her ears. "How long will it take to summon the Metaswarm?" she asked.
Whoa,
said Dr. Harmogen, surveying the boxes Pepper had set down around his hovel.
slow down. It's going to take a couple days just to unbox everything, then to get it all set up and calibrated.
How long, Dr. Harmogen? The exhibit closes in a little over 2 weeks. It had taken 3 days to plan the theft of the equipment.
Give me a week,
Dr. Harmogen said. Pepper nodded. All right. I'll be back in 1 week. Be ready. As it happened, Pepper needed the week to prepare anyway. First, she had to contact her fence. A man by the name of Blemis Flurd. Pepper had known Blemis for 10 years. He had helped her unload most of the big scores she'd made over the years. He'd also strongly advised her not to take on the Shashavaslapt job, arguing the statue would be too difficult to move. Pepper hadn't listened to him, and she'd regretted it ever since. He seemed ambivalent about the Emerald of Sobald Prime. This is the score of a lifetime, Pepper had said to Blemis when she'd gone to visit him in his modest apartment in downtown Yanthus Prime City. I can't believe you don't want in on this.
Don't get me wrong,
Blemis said, rubbing his bald head thoughtfully. He sat in a massive leather chair across from Pepper. Blemis was well over 6 feet tall and probably weighed close to 300 pounds. He had been a smuggler many years ago, but these days he was mostly retired except for occasionally finding buyers for expensive stolen goods.
I'll gladly take the emerald off your hands. I'm just wondering if you've thought this through.
I'm still working out the details of the heist, Pepper said. It's a little nutty, but I know this scientist who has these flies.
I'm not talking about the mechanics of the heist,
Blemis said.
I just want to make sure you understand just how valuable this stone is. If you thought you got a lot of heat for the Shashavaslap job, you haven't seen anything yet."
Pepper shrugged. Wouldn't be worth it to steal if it weren't valuable. Anyway, with what I make on this job, I'll be able to get off planet and buy a new identity. Hell, I could probably get my DNA scrambled. They'll never find me. Blemis raised an eyebrow.
"You think you'll get augmented?"
He was holding his hands in front of his chest. "No," said Pepper. "The whole idea is to avoid attention. Why would you even ask a question like that?"
"I know a guy who's done a lot of DNA scrambling for the Ursa Minor mob. He's really good with soft tissue."
"My soft tissue is just fine."
"I'm just saying it would draw attention away from your face."
Pepper glared. "Are you saying there is something wrong with my face?"
Not at all,"
Blemis said.
"But if you don't want people to recognize you, it's a good idea to distract them from your face."
"Well, I'm not getting augmented to keep people from looking at my face."
"All right,"
said Blemis.
"Maybe just have them fix your nose."
"There is nothing wrong with my nose."
"Of course not,"
said Blemis.
"But it doesn't really go with your eyes. You've got great eyes. If you had a cute little button nose and freckles. I love me some freckles."
"Are you about done?"
"I think so,"
said Blemis.
"If you had big boobs and a cute little nose, you'd be totally unrecognizable."
"Thanks for your expert opinion," said Pepper coldly. "Now can you get me a flight off-world? I need to get off Yanthus Prime as soon as possible after the heist."
"Shouldn't be a problem if that's really what you want to do,"
said Blemis. "What's gotten into you, Blemis? Have you gotten soft in your old age?"
"I'm way beyond soft,"
Blemis said, patting his oversized belly.
"I just want you to understand there's no going back after this job."
"I got it," Pepper said. "I'm not a child. This is a business transaction. I need passage off-world and enough money to pay my debts to the Ursa Minor Mafia and get myself a new identity. Whatever you can get for the emerald, you can keep the rest. Is it a deal, or do I need to get a new fence?" Blemis sighed.
"It's a deal," he said. "Give me a few days' warning, and I'll have a slot open on a ship to one of the interstellar hubs, no questions asked. I can have 500,000 credits in cash waiting for you. Contact me a few weeks after you get safely off-world, and I'll wire you half of whatever I'm able to sell the stone for."
Pepper was a little surprised that Blemis didn't try to haggle for a bigger cut, knowing the tight situation she was in. But she didn't complain. She trusted Blemis to give her the full 50%. He had never double-crossed her in the past. However much it ended up being, it would be plenty for her and Dr. Harmingen. "It's a deal," she said. They shook hands.
"Good luck,"
said Blemis as he saw Pepper to the door. Pepper thought this was a little odd, too. Blemis had never wished her good luck on a job. She didn't have time to ponder on whatever personal issues Blemis was going through, though. If she was going to pull off this job, she needed to focus all her concentration on planning the heist. The biggest hurdle was getting the custom lenses made to fit over the security cameras at the museum. First, she bought a camera of the same model used by the museum to make sure she got the specifications right. Then she went to see an engineer friend who could produce the lenses. Pepper had used this guy for several jobs in the past. His name was Tal, and he had a bit of a crush on Pepper, which was a good thing, because Pepper had no money to pay him with. It took some eyelash batting and vague hints about how her schedule would clear up once this job was finished, but Tal agreed to produce 10 lenses customized to her specifications. The lenses would be slightly larger in diameter than contacts, and only a few millimeters thicker, too small to register on the museum's motion detectors. The only problem was that in order to make them so small, Tal would have to use the latest picocircuitry design, which meant that the lenses would be susceptible to the museum's EMP defense. Pepper could carry the lenses inside the museum in a shielded case, but the lenses could only be exposed for at most 10 minutes before the EMP fried them and the cameras went dark. While she waited for Tal to finish the lenses, Pepper worked on programming the simulation software to respond to the oscillating camera movements. It took several days, but by the time the lenses were done, she was fairly confident she'd successfully adapted the software's navigational component to react accurately to the motion of the lenses. Once the lenses arrived, and she managed to get rid of Tal, she tested them with the camera. She had mounted the camera on a wall in the bar and set it to oscillate randomly, as the cameras in the museum were programmed to do. She placed a minute amount of temporary adhesive on the edge of one of the lenses and applied it to the camera's aperture. The screen on her desk, which had previously displayed a view of the room from the point of view of the camera, went black. Pepper tapped a button on a controller on her desk, activating the lens display. There was a flicker on the screen, and then it was once again filled with a view of the room. She was standing right in front of the camera, but the display showed nothing but an empty bar. Perfect. Now she just needed a way of getting the lenses onto the cameras without being seen. Her whole plan hinged on convincing insects to do this part of the job for her, and she had spent a great deal of effort over the past several days trying not to think about how insane this was. She had no idea if the metaswarm even existed, or if she could communicate with it, or if it would agree to cooperate with their plan, or, for that matter, if the flies were even capable of carrying the lenses. The whole plan was so crazy that she found the idea that the metaswarm had planted it in her mind increasingly attractive. Or was that just further evidence of her insanity? Maybe if she got caught, they'd send her to the loony bin instead of prison. That might be nice. When she'd tested the lenses to her satisfaction, she took a robocar back to Harmigen's hovel. Chapter 6.
"Pepper!"
Dr. Harmigen cried as she walked up the sidewalk.
"You're just in time. I've finished calibrating the transmitter. We're ready to summon the metaswarm."
Dr. Harmigen was standing outside of his house, next to a device that looked like a large antenna set on cinder blocks. "All right," Pepper said. "Let's do this." Dr. Harmigen took a step toward the transmitter and then hesitated.
"Pepper,"
he said,
"I want you to know that whatever happens, I don't regret this. Thank you for retrieving my equipment and giving me the chance to redeem myself."
"Of course," Pepper replied. "I'm glad you—" Wait a minute. What do you mean, whatever happens? What are you worried about happening?
"Well," said Dr. Harmingen, "you have to realize what you are asking. You are talking about bringing into existence an alien intelligence whose motivations we cannot possibly understand, so you can pull off a jewelry heist?"
Well, it sounds a little foolhardy when you put it like that, Pepper said, rubbing her jaw. But in my defense, I'm about 58% certain the heist was the Metaswarm's idea.
Said Dr. Harmingen. "Possibly, but even if the Metaswarm really was attempting to communicate with you, it's possible you've misunderstood what it was after. Or worse, what if the Metaswarm is just using you? What if it's seized on your greed to manipulate us into bringing it into being for its own nefarious purposes?"
"Like what?" Pepper asked.
"I don't know," Harmingen cried. "That's the point. Imagine a swarm of millions of insects directed by a powerful intelligence. What if the Metaswarm isn't content with a few square kilometers? What if they decide to take back Yanthus Prime for themselves?"
"Could they do that?"
"Probably," said Harmingen. "I just need you to understand what we're doing. We'll be letting the genie out of the bottle."
Pepper thought for a moment. If the flies could kick us off the planet, why haven't they done it yet?
"Because at this point, the Metaswarm's hold over the flies is too tenuous. The fly's behavior is being directed at the swarm level, and the swarms are in competition with each other for territory. Once I activate the transmitter, I'll be sending out a signal that summons the flies individually, overriding the swarm commands. Once the flies are all assembled in one place, the Metaswarm will theoretically manifest itself, but once that happens, I'll lose control over the individual flies. The Metaswarm will take over. There's no telling what it will do. If it were me, I'd sabotage the water treatment plant and turn the whole city into a swamp."
"That's, a little disturbing," Pepper said.
"Well, yes," Harmingen replied. "Oh, and there's one other thing."
"Fantastic," Pepper said without enthusiasm.
"There's a reason the swarms are so dispersed right now. Their habitat has been reduced to a few marshy areas scattered all over the city. If I summon all the flies here, most of them will never get back home. Something like half of the fly population will die off."
"Meaning what?"
"Meaning that if the Metaswarm doesn't like your plan, it's going to be pissed. And it might lash out by destroying the city."
Pepper stared at Dr. Harmingen. You didn't feel like you should maybe warn me about this earlier?
Would it have made a difference?
I might not have spent my last credit buying equipment for this job if I had known there was a possibility it was going to end with civilization being wiped out on the planet. Dr. Harmingen chuckled.
Of course you would have, Pepper. There was never any question about it. I saw it in your eyes the day you first showed up here. You were going through with this job no matter what.
Maybe, Pepper said. I still would have liked to have the choice.
The choice?
Dr. Harmingen cried.
Did the flies have a choice when developers took over their land? No. But you didn't cry then, did you? Well, I say it's time we give them a choice. If they decide to destroy us, maybe it's because we deserve it.
Pepper regarded Dr. Harmingen anxiously. She was starting to think maybe she should have looked into his motivations a little more deeply, and maybe considered the implications of bringing a new form of consciousness into existence. She had been so busy trying to convince herself she wasn't crazy that she never fully grasped just how crazy her plan was. On the other hand, part of her agreed with Dr. Harmingen. The swarms never had a chance. They thought they'd made peace with the settlers, only to have their land stolen by developers who filled in their beloved swamp to build a spaceport and crummy bars like the wobbly monolith. Shouldn't the insects get a say in their fate? Sure, there was a chance they'd wipe out civilization, but if Harmingen was right, there was also a pretty good chance civilization would wipe them out. Didn't they at least deserve a chance? Also, she really, really didn't want to work for the mob for the rest of her life. Screw it, Pepper said. Let's do this. Nothing happened for some time. Pepper and Dr. Harmingen sat in the front yard on crude lawn chairs, watching the transmitter, nursing bottles of peg-leg monkey. Are you sure that thing is on? Pepper asked after half an hour.
It's on, Dr. Harmingen said. It emits a signal at a frequency above the range of human hearing. Lucky you.
You mean you can hear it?
It's like a dentist drill, Harmingen said.
He downed the last of his beer and tossed the bottle in a high arc across the lawn. Ethel ran excitedly after it, skidding to a halt on the muddy ground. She grabbed the neck of the bottle in her mouth and ran back to Dr. Harmingen. Ethel had prehensile forearms like Dr. Harmingen, but she didn't seem to be aware of it.
She loves to play fetch,
said Dr. Harmingen. He took the bottle from his wife and scratched her behind the ears. She mooed contentedly.
That's my good girl,
Dr. Harmingen cooed. Pepper shuddered and forced herself to look away. She couldn't be sure, but it seemed like the cloud of insects buzzing around the transmitter was growing denser.
It's happening,
said Dr. Harmingen, looking around excitedly.
The matter swarm is forming.
Pepper nodded. Over the next several hours, the cloud grew even thicker. There had to be several million bugs buzzing around the area. They didn't buzz around Pepper's ears the way those in her bar tended to do, though. She took it as a good sign that they weren't actively trying to irritate her.
The only question now is whether there are enough of them to manifest consciousness,
Dr. Harmingen said.
Most of them should be here by now. I'm not sure this is enough."
"Enough for what?" asked a voice next to Dr. Harmingen. He and Pepper both jumped out of their chairs. "What the hell?" Pepper exclaimed, having spit out her beer. Did she just talk? They were both staring, aghast at Dr. Harmigen's wife.
"Ethel?"
Harmingen asked.
"I have no name,"
said Ethel. "Who are you?" Pepper asked. Ethel frowned at her.
"What kind of question is that? I just told you I don't have a name."
"Are you the Metaswarm?"
Dr. Harmingen asked.
"That is one way to think of me,"
Ethel said.
"I am a conscious entity composed of millions of flies, and also this one pear-shaped biped."
"Well, what should we call you?" Pepper asked.
"Ethel is fine."
"But you're not Ethel,"
Harmingen said. Ethel shrugged.
"I am Ethel, and I am several million flies. If it helps, think of Ethel as the spokesperson of the group."
"Why have you taken over Ethel?" Pepper asked.
"Don't be dramatic,"
Ethel said.
"I haven't taken over Ethel. Ethel is part of our collective. She has as much to say as any of the rest of us. Now let's stop wasting time. You've summoned us away from our habitat, and most of us don't have much time. I'm going to be gradually getting stupider over the next several hours until I lose consciousness completely and the swarm disbands. I understand you need our help with some sort of jewelry heist."
"Well, yes," said Pepper. "Actually, I sort of thought the heist was your idea."
"My idea?"
Ethel said.
"How would I... Oh, hang on. Yeah, the napkin thing. Okay, I see where you're going with this. Come to think of it, maybe it was my idea. I'm sorry. Up until a couple of minutes ago, I existed only in a semi-conscious state. I only have a vague notion what I was doing before I showed up here."
"But you know all about our plans for the heist?"
"I have been absorbing information from all my constituent members for some time. I am just now piecing most of it together. My understanding is that you are planning to steal the Emerald of Zobalt Prime, and that you intend to sell this gemstone and offer us a plot of land in exchange for our cooperation. Is that correct?"
Pepper nodded.
"Sounds good. I assume we're talking a three-way split of the proceeds?"
Pepper said. "We hadn't actually discussed cutting you in. Dr. Harmingen and I were going to go 50-50, but it was understood he'd be using his share to create a new habitat for you."
"Well, we're three intelligent entities, aren't we?"
Ethel asked.
"It would make sense to divide it three ways."
"Except that I'm doing most of the work," said Pepper. This whole thing was my idea.
"I thought you said it was Ethel's idea,"
Dr. Harmingen said. "Okay, look," said Pepper. "I'm sympathetic to your plight. I just need to pay off some debts and get off this planet. But keep in mind, we need to unload the stone in a hurry. We're only going to get a fraction of its actual value.
Even if we only get 20 million credits, Dr. Harmingen said, that gives the swarm—
Ethel, please,
said Ethel. Dr. Harmingen nodded. He seemed to have adjusted with aplomb to his wife's new role as the Metaswarm's representative.
That gives Ethel almost 6.7 million credits. And I'm sure I don't need that much. I'd be willing to give her 3 million of mine. 10 million credits will buy a lot of swampland.
Works for me, said Pepper.
Okay,
said Ethel.
then we just need to have a contract drawn up and notarized.
Pepper and Dr. Harmingen glanced uncertainly at each other.
Although, now that I think about it,
Ethel said,
we're engaged in a highly illegal enterprise, and I don't exist as a legal entity. So maybe that's not a good idea. Handshake?
The 3 co-conspirators shook hands.
All right,
Ethel said, rubbing her tiny hands together.
What exactly do you need me to do?
Chapter 7. Pepper stood stock still, waiting for the last of the museum's patrons to leave. She wore a ruffled dress and a flowery bonnet, the costume of a wealthy lady during the Yanthus Prime Civil War. The dress was reversible. The other side looked like the drab sort of dress women currently wore on Yanthus Prime. Pepper had ducked into a corner of the museum to get into costume, and then inserted herself into a crowd of animatronic aristocrats listening to a speech by Yanthus Prime's 13th president, Tolliver Oilskin. There were no cameras in this part of the museum. There wasn't anything of note to steal in the Civil War wing, so it was no trouble to creep into the display without being seen. The museum closed just after dark, but she waited for the guard to make his first rounds before leaving the display. Then she removed the ridiculous dress, under which she wore a holographic camouflage bodysuit. The suit didn't quite make her invisible, and it wouldn't fool motion detectors or heat sensors, but it would suffice to make her difficult to see that with a little luck and a compelling diversion, she could get past the cameras between her and the main exhibit room without being spotted. She tapped her comm, sending a signal that would trigger an incendiary device in a trash can in the museum's southern wing. She'd made a visit to the museum earlier that day to place it, as well as a few other surprises. If things went as expected, one of the guards would investigate the smoke, find a fire smoldering in the trash can, and put it out with the fire extinguisher across the hall. Meanwhile, Pepper would cross the hall between the Civil War exhibit and the gem exhibit. Pepper waited until the distant fire alarm sounded, and then got on her hands and knees. She'd tried this trick at the bar, using the camera and similar low lighting, and had found that if she crawled very slowly, keeping her movements rhythmic and uniform, she was nearly invisible. This trick wouldn't work in the exhibit room where the emerald was housed, though. Even if it weren't for the motion detectors and infrared sensors, the room was too well lit, and there were too many cameras. But for an empty hallway that presumably wasn't being watched very closely, it worked just fine. Pepper made it across without any other alarms sounding. The fire alarm stopped, which was another good sign. The fire had evidently been put out, and there was no indication the fire department had been called. She had a contingency plan in case the fire department showed up, but it would have complicated things. So far, so good. Pepper got to her feet, ensconcing herself in a small dead zone between two cameras. She withdrew a metal case, and a small plastic box from her pocket. She opened the box, revealing a toggle switch with a small light next to it. Pepper flipped the switch, and the light went on. The little box was an EMP canary, which Pepper had built herself the previous night. It was simply an LED light connected to a battery with a pico-circuit fuse in between. When the museum's EMP fired, it would fry any pico-circuitry in the area, including the fuse, and the light would go out. That would be Pepper's signal that she had 10 minutes until the next EMP surge. The EMP would short out the pico-circuitry in the lenses she had made to fit over the cameras, so she needed to keep them shielded in their case until the next surge. The light would also function as a signal to the Metaswarm, which had hidden dozens of its members throughout the museum. That was the plan, anyway. So far, Pepper hadn't seen any of the little flies, but she had to trust they were nearby. She had tested the EMP canary the previous night, and Ethel had claimed that the flies could actually hear the subsonic frequencies emitted by the device when the circuit was closed. When Pepper flipped the switch, a fly hidden somewhere nearby would transmit the message to another fly farther away, and that one would transmit it to another fly, etc., until the message was received by the Metaswarm itself, like a sensation being transmitted through nerves to a central brain. The Metaswarm would then send a group of flies to assist Pepper with the heist. The light went out less than 2 minutes after Pepper turned it on. Looking around, she saw no sign of the insects. Damn it, she thought. She had considered using a separate signal to summon the flies before the canary was triggered, but Ethel had convinced her it would be a needless complication, so now here she sat, with the clock ticking, and the damned bugs were nowhere to be seen. It occurred to her that maybe something in the museum was emitting noise at the same frequency as the canary, masking the sound. If that were the case, the flies were waiting for a signal they would never hear, and Pepper couldn't reactivate the device even if she wanted to. It was a one-shot deal. She had no other way of communicating with the swarm. They had deemed it too dangerous to attempt contact by radio. If the flies didn't show up soon, she was going to have to abort. But just as she was plotting her escape, one of the flies buzzed past her face, landing on the wall next to her. "It's about time," Pepper said. "Where are the rest of you?" She knew the fly couldn't understand her, but her words would be transmitted along the line back to the Metaswarm. After a few seconds, another fly landed on the wall, and then another, and another. Soon there were hundreds of them on the wall. Pepper realized they were arranging themselves in a deliberate configuration. They had formed letters. Pepper read aloud, "Sorry, traffic." Smile emoji. "Hilarious," said Pepper. "We're wasting time. Let's get to work." She opened the metal case, revealing the 10 custom lenses. "You know what to do," she said. "I hope." Several of the flies left the wall and flew toward the case. One fly landed on each lens. These flies were some of the larger specimens Pepper had seen. They had been hand-picked by the Metaswarm for this job. One by one, the flies took off, each of them carrying one of the lenses. She watched as they slowly buzzed toward the exhibit room next door, where the Emerald of Sobalt Prime was housed. The lenses were so heavy that several of them seemed to be having trouble maintaining altitude. "What the hell is wrong with them?" Pepper asked. "They didn't look like this last night." She didn't really expect an answer, but she saw that the flies on the wall were rearranging themselves again. "Tired. Long trip here." "Well, that's just great," Pepper said. "I risked everything for this job, and you guys can barely stay above the floor." The flies rearranged themselves again. "Relax. Watch." As she watched, several more flies left the wall, buzzing down the hall to the exhibit room. Pepper couldn't see very well at this distance, but it looked like most of the first wave was on the floor. The second wave of flies buzzed in, and after a moment Pepper realized they were taking over for the first wave. One by one, the replacement flies lifted off, each carrying one of the lenses. The first wave of flies remained on the floor, largely motionless. "So those first flies?" Pepper started. The flies on the wall moved again. "Dead." Pepper nodded. She realized that the metaswarm losing 10 flies was probably the equivalent of Pepper getting a haircut. Still, she took a moment to reflect solemnly on their sacrifice. The second wave of flies was now buzzing around the room, carrying their lenses. This part was not an exact science. As Pepper understood it, the metaswarm had essentially reprogrammed the flies' firmware, replacing their reproductive drive with a desire to place the lenses over the camera apertures. This was necessary because the operation was too precise for it to be completely directed by the intelligence of the metaswarm. By the time one of the flies communicated its position to the metaswarm and the metaswarm sent it a course correction, the fly could be several millimeters off course. The metaswarm could direct the fly's actions on a broad scale, but for the actual process of applying the lenses, it had to rely on the fly's instincts. Pepper was skeptical when Ethel had explained the concept to her, but Dr. Harmingen had convinced her it was the only way their plan would work. Seeing it in practice did little to reassure her. The flies seemed to be buzzing around the room at random. Checking her watch, she saw that they had less than 5 minutes until the next EMP. When it went off, it would fry the circuitry in the lenses, rendering them useless. Not only that, but the longer the flies buzzed around the room, the more likely it would be that someone watching the camera monitors would notice something was amiss. If security got suspicious at the flurry of insects in the exhibit room, they'd send someone to the room, and the jig would be up. But so far, there was no sign anyone had noticed. And one by one, the flies began to approach their targets. The cameras panned back and forth at random, and the flies struggled to land. Pepper watched as the first one slipped its lens into place, and then promptly fell to the floor dead. Still, no alarms went up. Presumably, that meant the lens was working as intended, transmitting the pre-recorded image of the room to the camera. Either that, or whoever was supposed to be watching the cameras was asleep. There were only 4 cameras in the room, and 10 lenses. That gave the flies a pretty good margin of error, but already 3 of the second-string flies were flagging. It seemed unlikely that they would reach their targets. That left 6 flies for 3 targets. Pepper had wanted to assign only 1 fly to a camera. Dr. Harmingen had convinced her that redundancy was better.
"Nature loves redundancy,"
Harmingen had said.
"That's why you get 100 million sperm fighting over a single egg. Increases the odds of success."
The downside of this strategy was what Pepper was now witnessing. 2 of the remaining flies had reached one of the cameras at the same time, and were now engaged in a sort of slow-motion dogfight, angrily bumping into each other. The 2 flies were literally fighting to the death over the chance to mate with a camera. "Can you do something about this?" Pepper asked, turning to the flies on the wall. The flies responded, "Patience." Pepper sighed. She now had less than 3 minutes to get into the exhibit room, grab the emerald, and get out before the cameras went black. This was cutting it way too close. Looking back into the exhibit room, She saw that 2 more flies had reached their target and were working their lenses into place. 4 more had fallen to the ground. That left only 1 camera with 2 flies fighting over it. 3 out of 4 wasn't going to cut it. Even with the holographic suit, she'd be plainly visible to whoever was watching the monitors. Finally, one of the 2 remaining flies plummeted to the floor. For several seconds, the last fly buzzed around the camera, struggling to retain altitude before finally settling on the camera's aperture. Pepper breathed a sigh of relief as it maneuvered the lens into place. The fly fell to the floor, dead. Chapter 8. Pepper took a deep breath, trying to prepare herself for the next step of the plan. Assuming the lenses were functioning correctly, the cameras would now show the emerald in its case in the middle of a completely empty exhibit room, and hopefully they would continue to show that scene while Pepper walked into the room and absconded with the emerald. It wasn't safe to enter the room quite yet, though. She still needed a little more help from the swarm to overcome the exhibit room's motion detectors and heat sensors. Turning her attention back to the wall where the flies had congregated, she saw that many thousands more flies had arrived to join the original group. Thousands more filled the air in the hall behind her. She had been so intent on the flies battling to mate with the cameras that she had barely noticed the increasingly loud buzzing. She could only hope there were enough of them. Pepper checked her watch. The EMP would go off in less than 2 minutes. "Ready?" she asked the wall of flies. The swarm replied, "Almost." It was now forming letters by creating negative space between the flies. "Well, hurry up," Pepper said. "If you're not ready in 10 seconds, I'm gonna just have to run in and hope for—" But as she spoke, the mass of flies left the wall, joining those in the air around her. They were so thick that she could barely see across the room. The swarm gradually coalesced around her, creating a vaguely pepper-shaped cloud. At least that was the idea. Pepper couldn't see well enough to determine whether the camouflage was working. She had no way of communicating with the swarm in this state, but she was out of time. All she could do is head toward the exhibit room and hope for the best. Pepper walked slowly toward the exhibit room, and the swarm came with her. She walked with her eyes closed, hands held out in front of her, relying on her memory to get her to the emerald. Forcing herself not to hurry, she kept her movements slow and smooth. The theory was that the swarm's presence would sufficiently confuse the room's motion detectors and heat sensors that Pepper's presence would go undetected. Dr. Harmingen had confirmed that the theory was sound, but they'd been unable to test it. So Pepper was relieved when her fingers brushed against the glass display case that housed the emerald. No alarms sounded. Pepper crouched in front of the case, pulling a small plasma cutter and an adhesive cup with a handle from her pocket. She waved at the flies in front of her face, hoping that they would take it as a signal that she needed to see. The swarm thinned slightly in front of her, and she fastened the cup to the case and then cut a grapefruit-sized hole with the plasma cutter. She pulled the glass disc toward her and set it on the floor, then reached into the case and grabbed the emerald. It was the size of a golf ball. She slipped it into her pocket and stood up, then slowly turned and began to walk back the way she had come. In less than a minute, the EMP would fire and the lenses would go black. The initial confusion would probably buy her another minute or two. The security guards would most likely suspect a technical malfunction. When they were unable to bring the cameras back online, they would send someone to investigate and trigger the alarm, summoning the Yanthus Prime City Police. If Pepper wasn't out of the museum by then, she was as good as caught. After several steps, the swarm suddenly began to dissipate, and Pepper realized she was back in the hall. She checked her watch. 23 seconds. "So that's how it's going to be," Pepper said as the flies disappeared into various vents. "Every sentient being for itself." A group of a few hundred flies settled on the wall to her right and crawled into formation. They spelled, "Good luck." "Thanks a lot," Pepper grumbled. She got on her hands and knees again and moved as fast as she dared down the hall. It would have been nice to have another incendiary device to set off as a distraction, but 2 incidents like that in one night would have been suspicious. She had to rely on stealth, the holographic suit, and the inattentiveness of whoever was monitoring the camera feeds. Once out of camera range, she stood up and began to walk briskly. By now, the lenses would have gone dark. The security guard monitoring the feed would be running diagnostics to try to pinpoint the problem. Those tests would indicate that the cameras and lights in the exhibit room were both functioning normally, which could only mean that someone was blocking the cameras. She'd made it to the Civil War exhibit, where she could avoid the wall cameras by moving in a zigzag pattern she had memorized. She was halfway through when an alarm sounded. Behind her, plasteel gates slammed shut to protect the emerald. The jig was up. The cops had been alerted. She had maybe another 5 minutes to get out of the museum while avoiding the museum's security guards. Subtlety no longer being an option, Pepper pulled another small device from her pocket, a nondescript plastic box. She opened the box and flipped the switch inside. Immediately, deafening bangs began to echo through the museum. Around corners, ahead of her and behind, multicolored lights flashed and smoke began to fill the building. This was Pepper's Hail Mary escape plan. The incendiary device that had provided cover for her entry wasn't the only surprise she'd planted. She'd placed pyrotechnics and smoke bombs in trash cans throughout the museum. The smoke would help cover her movement, and the pyrotechnics would set off sensors throughout the building, making it impossible to pinpoint her location. She fought her instincts, which told her to make a beeline for the nearest exit. The security guards would have figured out by now that someone was after the emerald, and they'd be covering all the nearby exits. Her best bet was to go where they wouldn't expect, deeper into the museum. Moving quickly and smoothly, she ran down the route she had memorized, banking on the holographic suit and the smoke to hide her from the cameras. She caught a glimpse of a security guard rounding a corner in front of her and slipped momentarily into a shadowy alcove as they passed. Then she continued on, turning when she reached the domed greenhouse at the center of the museum. The greenhouse was maybe 50 meters across and filled with hundreds of species of plants. With the room dark and the stars visible through the glass above, Pepper could easily imagine that she was deep in a jungle on a planet far from Yanthus Prime. She removed a small gun-shaped device from her belt and fired it toward the dome overhead. A cherry-sized globule of a sticky, rubbery substance shot from the gun and thunked against the glass. Attached to the glob was a nearly invisible microfilament line that connected to Pepper's belt. She pressed a button, and the line went taut, pulling her upwards. When she neared the glass, some 10 yards above the floor, she hit the button again, and the servos in her belt winch stopped. She pulled the plasma cutter from her belt and began to cut a person-sized hole in the glass. She had almost completed the circle when she heard footsteps moving toward her. She shut off the cutter and froze. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see a security guard striding into the room, holding a flashlight in front of him. Pepper hoped the man was just cutting through the room, but he stopped a few meters into the room and started looking around the greenhouse, apparently suspecting that the intruder might be hiding among the plants. Fortunately, he had not yet thought to look up. As the man made his slow, deliberate survey of the greenhouse, Pepper caught a glint of light reflected from the glass above. It took her a split second to realize the gap in the circle had cracked. The half-meter disc of glass was going to fall. Pepper swept her right arm out and clamped her hand on the edge of the glass as it fell past her. It was heavier than she expected. The glass was nearly 2 centimeters thick. It nearly slipped out of her fingers before she grabbed it with her other hand as well. She hung upside down from the microfilament at her waist, straining to hold on to the heavy glass disc. Below her, the guard continued to wave his flashlight slowly back and forth. The glass was slowly slipping from her gloved fingers. She wasn't going to be able to hold it for long. If she timed it right, she might be able to hit the guard right on his head. In addition to the difficulty of this task, though, Pepper was worried the blow to the skull might kill the man. He was just a museum security guard, after all. He didn't deserve to die for doing his job. But the alternative was to let the glass fall to the marble floor and shatter. The guard would quickly realize it had fallen from the ceiling and look up, and Pepper would be caught. A blast from his stun gun would incapacitate her until the police arrived. Her only chance was to drop the glass far enough from the guard that he wouldn't immediately realize what had happened. If she could toss it into one of the planters a few meters from where he stood, he might be distracted long enough for her to climb onto the roof and escape. Squeezing the glass disc as tightly as she could, she began to rock back and forth, swinging her body and the glass like a giant pendulum. The centrifugal pull added to the weight made it even harder to hold onto the glass, and it slipped even farther until her fingertips were barely clutching the edge. She couldn't see below her, and all she could hear was the rushing of blood in her head. The shadows dancing on the wall 20 meters or so in front of her indicated that the guard was still standing underneath her, scanning the room with his flashlight. Pepper managed to swing back and forth 3 more times, increasing the length of her arc each time. At the peak of the 3rd forward swing, the glass slipped from Pepper's left hand. She managed to hold onto it for another second or so with her right before letting it go at the apogee of her backward swing. Feeling like she was on the verge of blacking out, she swung herself forward once more. At the end of the arc, she hooked the fingertips of her left hand on the edge of the hole over her head. As she grabbed the edge with her right hand as well, she listened for the sound of the glass shattering below. It didn't come. Pepper swung her legs onto the other side of the glass, released the microfilament line, and glanced down. Now she saw what had happened. Letting go of the glass with her left hand had caused the disc to pivot sideways, so it had landed on its edge. The disc was now rolling toward the doorway the guard had walked through a few seconds earlier. As she watched, a second guard came through the doorway and immediately had his legs knocked out from underneath him by the heavy glass disc. He fell to the floor, screaming and clutching his knee. The disc wobbled and fell to the floor like a gigantic coin. The other guard spun to face the newcomer.
"Steve!"
he asked uncertainly, shining his flashlight on the man howling on the ground.
"Is that you? What happened?"
"Glass! Hit me!"
Steve moaned.
"Glass?"
asked the other man.
"What the—"
As the answer dawned on him, he craned his neck upward. But Pepper had already clambered onto the top of the pane. She gave the guard a grin and a wave and made her way down the dome to the flat part of the museum roof. She heard sirens and saw flashing lights in the distance. The cops were on their way. But it would take them some time to close a perimeter around the museum. By then, Pepper would be long gone. She ran along the roof of the museum toward an alley, keeping low to avoid being seen. She leaped across the alley to the roof of a nearby building, then continued across it and made her way down a fire escape. Meandering through the maze of alleys and side streets, she came to a trash bin where she'd stashed a bag containing a change of clothes. She dumped her gear in the bin and put on the clothes over the stealth suit, then called a robocab to meet her at an intersection a few blocks away. The car was waiting when she got there. She got inside and told it to drive toward the spaceport. When she was certain she wasn't being followed, she gave it the coordinates to Blemis's apartment. She had briefed Blemis on the basics of her plan and told him when to expect her. The cab pulled up 10 minutes later, and she got out and took the elevator to the 38th floor apartment. The door to the apartment opened before she could even knock.
"Good evening, Pepper,"
said the small gray-haired man who opened the door.
"It seems that we have some business to discuss."
It was Sam Suharu. Chapter 9. "What the hell are you doing here, Sam?" Pepper blurted out. "Where's Blemis?"
"Come in, please, Pepper,"
Sam said.
"I'd prefer not to discuss business in the hallway."
Pepper reluctantly entered the apartment. She saw that Blemis was seated in his oversized chair, a glum look on his face. A burly member of the pig-like Nork species stood next to him, holding a laser gun. "Are you okay, Blemis? Did these bastards hurt you?"
"I'm okay,"
said Blemis. He seemed more embarrassed than afraid.
"He's fine,"
Sam said, taking a seat on the couch next to Blemis.
"Please, Pepper,"
he said.
"have a seat."
Pepper glanced at the Nork, who glowered at her. She sat down.
"Do you have it on you?"
Sam asked. "I don't know what you're talking about," Pepper replied. Sam sighed.
"Blemis told us all about your plan. Something about insects. I have to admit, it sounded crazy to me, but if my reports from the scene are correct, you pulled it off."
Pepper glared at Blemis.
"Don't blame him,"
Sam said.
"He tried to warn you. As usual, you didn't listen."
"Warn me? What are you talking about?"
"Think about it, Pepper. Why do you think the Emerald of Sobalt Prime was put on display on a backwater planet like Yanthus Prime? The Ursa Minor mob arranged this whole thing. We made a rather generous grant to the Yanthus Prime City Museum, in the name of a shell company, of course, that was contingent upon the museum getting on the list of venues where the Emerald of Sobalt Prime would be displayed. With that grant, the museum was able to provide a kickback to the owners of the Emerald, convincing them to add Yanthus Prime to the list of locations on the tour."
Pepper stared at him. You got the emerald moved here so you could steal it.
That was the idea,
Sam said.
The security at Yanthus Prime City Museum has always been laughably ineffective, as you well know. Unfortunately, the current museum director is smarter than I gave him credit for. He used some of our grant money to upgrade the museum's security. We called in every expert we'd ever worked with to try to figure out how to bypass the security, including Blemis here. He wasn't particularly helpful, at least not at first. But then a few days ago he called me and told me he might know a way to get the emerald.
Pepper turned to Blemis. You told them I was going to steal the emerald. You double-crossed me.
I'm sorry, Pepper,
Blemis said.
I had no choice. Sam knows I'm your fence. If the emerald went missing, he'd come after me.
You could have told me, Pepper said.
If he'd told you, you wouldn't have done it,
Sam said. We could have come to some kind of arrangement. Hell, the only reason I'm doing this is because of the money I owe you guys. I just need to get off planet. You guys could have had the rest of my share.
As I understand it,
Sam said,
your share is only a third of what's left after Blemis takes his cut. The rest was going to go to this Dr. Harmagen character.
Well, technically only a third goes to Dr. Harmagen. The rest goes to the Metaswarm.
Ah, yes, the Metaswarm,
said Sam, chuckling.
I didn't believe it when Blemis told me, but I told myself, Pepper is a smart girl. Give her a chance and maybe she'll pull this off, and by space, you did it.
Yeah, said Pepper unenthusiastically. Yay me.
Cheer up, Pepper,
Sam said.
I appreciate your hard work on this job. Perhaps we can still come to some kind of arrangement.
What kind of arrangement?
Blemis tells me you want passage off planet and enough money to change your identity. I can make that happen. I've got a ship fueled up and ready to go.
In exchange for what?
The emerald, of course.
Pepper studied Sam for a moment. You're saying Dr. Harmagen and the Metaswarm get screwed? Sam laughed.
Well, yeah. I'm not cutting in a disgraced old man and a bunch of insects. I'm paying you and Blemis a reasonable fee for your time and expertise. But the emerald is mine.
Pepper continued to stare. But she was no longer watching Sam. She was watching the wall behind him, on which several dozen flies had landed. They gradually coalesced to form the words, "Do it." Pepper's eyes locked on Sam's. "Fine," she said, "but I'm going to need some assurances."
All right,
Sam said cautiously.
What kind of assurances?
I want to see this ship.
Ship?
Asked Sam, seeming confused. The one you've got waiting for me?
Oh, yeah,
Sam exclaimed.
Of course, the ship.
Pepper's eyes narrowed. You'd better not be jerking me around, Sam. She pulled the emerald from her left pocket, and with her right hand she unhooked the plasma cutter from her belt. She held the tip of the cutter to the emerald.
You wouldn't,
said Sam. I absolutely would, said Pepper. This thing can cut through a diamond. An emerald might as well be butter. One scratch on this stone, and it's worthless.
All right, Sam said. Take it easy, Pepper. I'll take you to the ship.
Now, Pepper said. Sam nodded. He turned to the gun-toting Nork.
Zardus, get the car.
Zardus grunted and walked to the door.
Let's go, Pepper,
said Sam, getting up from his chair. You first, Pepper said. Sam shrugged and followed Zardus out the door. Pepper, still holding the plasma cutter to the stone, followed him. 20 minutes later, Sam's car pulled up to a hangar near the spaceport. Parked nearby was the most beautiful spaceship Pepper had ever seen. It was sleek and black and appeared to be brand new. Sam certainly hadn't skimped on an escape vehicle. Pepper, Sam, and Zardus got out. Wow, said Pepper, staring at the ship. She was still holding the emerald and the plasma cutter.
Nice, huh?
Sam said.
She's all yours. Keys are inside.
Pepper frowned as she read the letters on the side of the ship. They read, Fiat Tenebris. What the hell is that supposed to mean?
Hell if I know, said Sam. The designer probably just needed a name, so they made up something that sounded cool.
It's Latin,
Zardus said.
It means, let there be darkness.
Well, that's depressing, said Pepper. I'm going to have to rename it.
The name can be anything you want. It's a blank slate as far as I'm concerned.
Tabula rasa,
Zardus murmured.
Oh, that's pretty good,
said Sam.
You should go with that.
Hang on, said Pepper. Who's that? The gangplank of the ship had been lowered, and 2 men were leaving the ship. It soon became evident they were wearing the bright orange armor of the Malarkian Marines. Marines, Pepper gasped. Sam, what the... Just then something struck her on the back of her head, and she stumbled to the ground. She was vaguely aware of someone grabbing the emerald out of her hand. As she rolled onto her back, dazed, she saw Zardus standing over her, the emerald in one hand and a blackjack in the other.
Sic transit gloria,
Zardus said.
Took you long enough,
Sam replied.
I had to wait until she was distracted,
said Zardus. You bastard, Pepper muttered. You never had any intention of letting me go.
I'm afraid that's true,
Sam replied.
I was just stalling.
But then, whose ship? Pepper asked. A shrill, loud voice squeaked at them from the darkness.
You're early. Apologies, your lordship,
said Sam.
Had a bit of complication with our procurement division.
Pepper turned her head to see an imposing man striding toward them, flanked by 2 Marines. He wore a tight-fitting crimson leather uniform, a helmet festooned with peacock feathers, and a luxurious fur cape. It was Heinous Vlak. Chapter 10.
You have the emerald,
Vlak asked.
His Primacy is very anxious to complete his collection.
Right here,
Sam said.
Zardus, give the man the emerald.
Caveat emptor,
said Zardus, handing Vlak the emerald.
What's your narc jabbering about?
Vlak squeaked.
Ignore him,
said Sam with a glare at Zardes. As Vlak examined the emerald, Pepper got slowly to her feet.
And who is this?
Vlak asked.
A loose end, Sam said. I was about to have Zardes take care of her. Pity,
said Vlak.
She'd be cute if she did something about that nose.
Space yourself, Vlak, Pepper spat.
I see my fame has preceded me,
Vlak said.
Do I know you, young lady?
The stench still lingers from the last time you visited this planet.
Charming,
said Vlak.
Kill her. Right here?
Asked Sam.
We're in full view of the spaceport.
Vlak broke into laughter.
What are you worried about? The police? Have you forgotten our arrangement? Now that you've given me the emerald, your syndicate has the full backing of the monarchy. You no longer need to worry about the local police. Very good, said Sam, nodding with approval. It's been a pleasure doing business with you, Vlak. I am confident that our takeover of Yanthus Prime will be profitable for us both. It had better be,
replied Vlak.
Now, if you don't mind, I must be going. Are you going to kill her, or am I? We'll do it, said Sam. Zardes?
Zardes nodded and reached for the laser gun at his hip. As he did so, a fly landed on his nose. He brushed it away with his left hand, but 2 more landed on his forehead.
Stop screwing around and shoot her,
Sam growled. But even as he spoke, several more flies landed on Zardes's face. Many more were buzzing around his head. Zardes began waving his gun at them as well.
Watch it,
Sam cried, ducking as the gun swung in his direction. The Marines drew their weapons too.
Everybody cool it,
shrieked Vlak. But the flies had begun to plague the rest of them as well. They were buzzing around Sam's head and seemed to be getting inside the Marines' helmets. The Marines, barely able to see through their helmets as they were, stumbled around, swatting wildly at the flies. They stumbled into each other, fired simultaneously, and fell to the tarmac, dead. Meanwhile, heinous Vlak was struggling to remove his helmet.
Get it off!
He shrieked.
They're going up my knees!
It was unclear whether he was sneezing or retching. Sam and Zardes, almost completely obscured in a dark cloud of flies, were running around in circles, swatting futilely at themselves. The only person the flies weren't bothering was Pepper. In the distance, she saw headlights approaching. While Vlak continued to struggle with his helmet and Sam and Zardes ran in circles, a car pulled up next to Sam's. 2 small, pear-shaped figures got out. "Dr. Harmigen!" Pepper cried. "What are you doing here?"
Ethel told me you were in trouble. Where's the emerald?
"Vlak's got it."
Hey, Vlak!
Dr. Harmingen yelled, walking toward him.
Drop the emerald and I'll call off the flies.
No!
Vlak shrieked.
It's mine! I'm not giving up a priceless emerald to get rid of a few annoying bugs!
100 flies are annoying, Dr. Harmingen said. 1,000 are a severe respiratory hazard.
Vlak made the sneeze-retching sound again.
Gah!
He howled, dropping the emerald.
Okay, fine! Just make them go away!
Dr. Harmagin strode forward and picked up the emerald. He turned and nodded to Ethel. Ethel made some incomprehensible squealing noises. A few seconds later, Vlack fell to his knees, coughing loudly in his helmet. A swarm of flies continued to buzz ominously overhead. Sam and Zardes sank to the ground exhausted. A cloud of flies hovered above them as well. "Thank you, Ethel," said Pepper, rubbing the bump that was forming on the back of her head. "Sorry things went a little off script there. I didn't intend to double-cross you."
I know,
said Ethel with a smile.
nothing I can't handle.
"Turns out that we make a pretty good team," said Pepper.
"Indeed," said Dr. Harmagin. "It's almost a pity this is probably the only chance we'll have to work together."
He was examining the emerald in his palm. Ethel shrugged.
Speak for yourself. I'm exhausted. I've lost 10% of my population in the past few hours.
"I'm sorry, sweetie,"
said Dr. Harmagin, putting his other arm around her.
"I know this has been rough on you. But with the money we'll get from fencing the emerald, we'll be able to create a whole new habitat for the swarm."
"Just tell Blemis I sent you," Pepper said. "If he gives you any trouble, well—" She glanced at Heinous Vlack, who was getting to his feet, shaky and breathing heavily. His hand was on the laser gun at his hip. He eyed the swarm still hovering over his head.
"Ethel can take care of herself," Dr. Harmagin said. "But if you're going to leave, you'd better go now."
Pepper glanced at the Fiat Tenebris. She could hardly believe it was really happening. She was really going to get off this damned planet. "You guys are sure you'll be okay?"
We'll be fine.
said Ethel.
We'll head over to Blem's apartment now. Once we get the money for the emerald, Zully can start working on the habitat. If these jerks give us any trouble, I can take care of it. Tough guys become strangely compliant when you threaten to fill their nasal passages with insects.
Sam and Zardes shuddered. Heinous Vlack glared at her. "That's it, then?" Pepper said. "We're square."
We're square,
Ethel said. "Good," said Pepper. "So, I have just one more question." She looked from Ethel to Dr. Harmagin. "So now that Ethel is... is the metaswarm going to... I guess what I'm asking is, do you two..." They stared at her blankly. "You know what?" Pepper said. "Never mind. Good luck with the habitat and whatever else you crazy kids get up to. I'm out of here."
Safe travels,
cried Ethel and Dr. Harmagin together. Pepper gave them a salute and ran toward the spaceship.
I'll get you for this,
Heinous Vlack shrieked, shaking his fist in the air.
Cree tenet teniat, cree dolet doliat,
said Zardes wistfully. Pepper ran up into the ship. It was as beautiful inside as it was outside. She climbed into the cockpit, closed the gangplank, and hit the ignition. The engines purred to life. "Oh my," she said, her heart racing. "You are a bad little kitty." She hit the throttle and the sleek black ship shot into space. She was free. This has been the Yanthus Prime Job, a Pepper Melange novella, in the Starship Grifter series written by Robert Kroese. Narrated by J.D. Ledford. Copyright 2017 by Robert Kroese. Production copyright 2017 by Robert Kroese.